Starting off with the M1911 fan favorite gun, the base version of it is going to do 20 damage, and the ammo capacity is 8 in the magazine and 80 in reserve. Now this gun's very basic, it's not going to do much in the higher rounds, but when you pack punch it to the Mustang and Sally, that's when things get a little bit more spicy. When pack punching it to the Mustang and Sally, the damage is going to increase by a ton, with maximum damage being able to do 1200 damage. These are also dual wield and do splash damage as well. In terms of ammo, you're going to get 6 in each pistol, and then in reserve, you're going to be getting 50. Now straight at the bat, this gun is one of the best ones to have on high rounds in terms of actually killing stuff. It's actually going to do some damage, and you're actually going to get some kills with it, unlike some of the other weapons in this video. Moving on to the CZ75, this gun is going to do roughly 150 damage when it's not pack-a-punch. In terms of ammo, you got 50 in the magazine, and then you got 130 in reserve. Now, again, another basic pistol, and when you pack-a-punch it, it doesn't do that much better. It goes up to 300 damage, which is, yeah, double, and the head multiplier is 3.5. You get an ammo increase in the magazine to 20, and then in reserve you have 240. And to be honest, this gun ain't gonna do that much in the higher rounds. It's pretty bad. But it is a pistol, so what do you really expect? And it can also get it in a dual wield version of it, and it is a little better because there's 2 of them. The 2 only redeeming factors to this gun is 1, it's full auto when it's pack-a-punched, and the pack-a-punch name, the Calamity, is pretty cool. Moving on to the Python, this gun is actually going to be quite strong on the lower rounds with 1000 damage, and with a multiplier of 1.5 unpack-a-punched. It's going to get some kills on the earlier rounds, with 6 in the magazine and 84 in reserve, but when you pack-a-punch it, nothing really happens. The damage will still be 1000, with the head multiplier going up to 3, so you could do a bit more damage on the higher rounds, a bit more ammo with 12 in the magazine and 96 in reserve. It's a shame because the gun actually doesn't improve all that much. And even in a scenario where you get headshots with this thing all on one zombie, that's only going to total up to 32,400 damage, and you're just not going to reach enough damage to actually kill a zombie with it. Moving on to some of the better guns in this game, the rifles. First of all, we'll start off with the AUG, which in terms of damage can do a maximum of 140, and then the head multiplier is 4 on it as well, so you could rack that up a wee bit. In terms of ammo, it has 30 in the magazine and 270 in reserve. And when you pack punch it to the AUG 50 M3, it's going to go up to 200 damage with a head multiplier of 5. It's still unfortunately not going to do enough. If you use the AUG and pack-a-punch and then pack-a-punch it and then, kill the same zombies and such with it, you might be able to get a few kills, but it'll only be a few. The same scenario kind of happens with the Commando, which has a maximum damage of 150 with a head multiplier of 4. And with ammo, you're looking at 30 in the magazine and 270 in reserve. When you pack punch it to the Predator, it goes up to 210, which is more powerful than the AUG. And in terms of ammo, you're getting 40 in the magazine compared to the 30 that you were with a Commando, and then in reserve, you're getting 360. Again, this gun ain't gonna kill that much in the higher rounds. You'll maybe get 1 or 2 if you use the Commando, then the Predator to finish off the Horde. It's still gonna have somewhat of a struggling time killing foe. Moving on to the FAMAS, that has a maximum damage of 100 with a head multiplier of 4, and then 30 in the magazine, and then 150 in reserve. It's going to be fine on the lower rounds like all the other weapons, but on the higher rounds it ain't going to do much. When you pack punch it to the G16 though, it does a little better. The damage goes up to 150, the head multiplier turns to 5, with 45 in the magazine, and then 225 in reserve. This gun is the least likely one out of the rifles, I would say, to actually get a kill, just because the damage is quite low. And this would be fine if it had ammo to compensate for that, but it really doesn't. So you might get a few kills if you use the strat again, where you use the unimpacked and then pack-a-punch-it version, but it's still going to seriously struggle. The one gun that is actually kind of decent on the higher rounds is the FAL. Even though it gets memed on quite a lot, it actually is more powerful than some of the other guns. The FAL as a base weapon is a semi-automatic. It does 160 damage maximum with a head multiplier of 4. When you're looking at the magazine, you're looking at 20 in there and then 180 in reserve. But when you pack punch it to the Epic Win, you're going to be getting a maximum damage of 240 with a head multiplier of 5. The gun turns into a 3-round burst, which is kind of cool. The ammo mag capacity will go up to 30, and then in reserve you're getting 360, so quite a big buff from the FAL. Now it's going to get a few kills in the higher rounds again if you use the FAL and then the Epic Win in combination, but it most likely won't take out a whole horde. Then moving on to the G11 with 100 damage, and then a multiplier of 4 for headshots. This gun's also a 3-round burst, and with the magazine you're getting 48 in there, and then 144 in reserve. So there's quite a lot in the magazine, and when you pack-a-punch it, the damage doesn't go up that much. It goes up to 150, the head multiplier goes up to 5, the magazine stays the same, but the ammo has quite a significant increase with it going to 288. Again, you'll get a few kills, maybe 1 or 2, but it's not going to do that much. The Galil, on the other hand, will, with the base version of it having 150 damage, alongside with it having a multiplier of 4 for headshots, the magazine having 35 in it, and then the reserve having 315. Is when you pack-a-punch this thing though, it becomes an absolute monster, with its damage going to 220, the head multiplier going to 5, getting that 30 rounds in the magazine still, but 490 in reserve. It's actually mental how much of a step up the Galil is compared to all the other weapons. This thing just has so much ammo, and it damages okay as well. This is definitely going to at least get you a few kills, and it's probably the best assault rifle in terms of overall damage output anyway. Then moving on to the God Gun, the M14, with the damage of 105, a head multiplier of 3, alongside 8 in the magazine and a 96 in reserve. And then when you pack-a-punch it, the damage will go up to 200. The head multiplier will be 6, and with 16 in the magazine and 192 in reserve, it has okay-ish ammo. This thing isn't going to kill anything on the higher rounds though. If you're ever so lucky, maybe 1, but in terms of practicality use, it's just that there's no point, don't use it. There's so many other guns, there's better wall guns to use, just avoid this thing. The best wall gun you could use is probably going to be the M16, which has 100 damage, a head multiplier of 4, 30 in the magazine and 120 in reserve. But when you pack-punch it to the Skull Crusher, you're going to get that damage up to 150, a head multiplier of 5, 30 still in the magazine, but then 270 in reserve, so quite a big increase in ammo. To be honest, this thing by itself ain't going to do that much on the higher rounds, but you can buy ammo for it, so you will get kills slowly. I probably wouldn't recommend it, but if you want something to take along with the long haul, I would say the M16 is probably your go-to. Now going with the SMGs, we have the AK-74U. Now this thing's going to do 120 damage. It has a head multiplier of 4, 20 in the magazine, and 160 in reserve. So it's going to do mid-ish rounds okay, but when you start getting into the later 20s, it's going to fall off quite heavily. But when you pack-punch it, the damage goes up a good amount. It's 190, a head multiplier of 5, with 40 in the magazine, and then 280 in reserve. Now, the best thing this gun has for it is the fact that it's a wall buy. It will probably struggle to get kills in the higher round, I'm not gonna lie. But just like most of the weapons on this list, the fact that they're wall buys means that you can get a few kills with them, since you have a constant supply of ammo that you can go and buy. The MP5K is quite similar in that respect, where it has alright damage, it's quite low, but it's 100 with a head multiplier of 4, with 30 in the magazine and 120 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, you're going to get 140 damage, a 5 headshot multiplier, 40 in the magazine, and then 200 in reserve. Not gonna lie, this thing also isn't that great. The fact that it's a wall weapon kind of helps it a wee bit, but in the long run I would just avoid using this. If you're going to get a wall weapon, you'd get something like the M16 or the absolute GOAT, the MP40. Now the MP40 will do 100 damage, has 32 in reserve, it has a 4 headshot multiplier, and the magazine has 192 in it. When you pack-a-punch it to the afterburner, the damage will double to 200, the head multiplier will become 5, the magazine size will go up to 64, and then in reserve you still have 192. Now, this is one of the strongest SMGs. But even with that, on round 50, you're still going to be hard-pressed to actually get a kill with this thing. It's not bad as an overall weapon, and if you went to the higher rounds, you could use this and, you know, you progress your rounds slowly, but surely since it's a wall weapon. But in that case, like, you'd just rather get something that would actually kill. I think for weapons on the wall in general, it's actually alright if they're a little bit weaker, just because that's what you want in a wall weapon. You want something that's going to get you points early on, so you can hit the mystery box and get the guns that do more damage. The MPL, this thing's just kind of mid overall. So the damage is going to be 100, the headshot multiplier is going to be 4, there's 24 in the magazine, and then there is 120 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, the damage goes up by 40, not that much, 140. The headshot multiplier is 5, with 40 in the magazine, and then there's 200 in reserve. This thing is just don't get it. It's not going to do anything on the higher rounds. The only thing that's decent about it is the mobility, but a lot of the SMGs have good mobility, so why would you bother? Moving on to the PM63, this thing has 100 damage, a headshot multiplier of 4, the magazine being 20, and then in reserve you have 100. It's okay on the lower rounds. When you pack a punch it, it turns into Tokyo and Rose. And what's cool about this is it's a dual wield weapon, so you're getting 140 damage on this bad boy. There's a 5 headshot multiplier. In your mags, you're getting 25 per pistol, and then reserve, you're getting 225. This thing's actual damage input is actually not that bad since it's dual wield. The issue is it doesn't have enough ammo to compensate for it, so it's not going to do a lot on the higher rounds. Again, it's a wall weapon, so that's good. It means you can always go back and get ammo for it, but you're still going to be pretty hard pressed to get any kills with it. Moving on to the Spectre, you're getting damage of 90, headshot multiplier being 4 with 30 in the magazine and 120 in reserve. This gun's alright on lower rounds, it's not that special. When you pack punch it into the Phantom, the damage goes up to 130, the headshot multiplier going to 5, the mag capacity goes up to 45, and in reserve you're going to get 225. This gun's pretty weak, I wouldn't recommend it for high rounds, it just ain't that good. Moving on to the LMGs, you have the HK21, which does 150 damage, headshot multiplier of 3 with 125 in the magazine and then 500 in reserve. And when you pack a punch it, you're going to get 210 damage on that bad boy, a free headshot multiplier with 150 in the magazine and then 750 in reserve. So this thing's mobility is awful. Let's just get that right out the gate. But its actual potential to kill zombies in round 50 is very high because it has a lot of ammo, the damage is alright. And compared to practically everything on this list, bar the M1911, Mustang and Sally, it's actually going to get some kills on the higher rounds. The next LMG we have is the RPK with 130 damage, a free headshot multiplier, 100 in the magazine, and then 400 in reserve. Now, this gun's alright. When you pack punch it to the R115 resonator, damage will go up to 180, the headshot multiplier will be 3. With 125 being in the magazine, you will get some kills with this. It's not as good as the HK21, but it's still alright to have on the higher rounds. Moving on to the most powerful gun in this game, it'd be the Dragunov. So, the base version of it having 300 with a head multiplier of 10. That's right, you heard me right, 10 in the headshot multiplier, with 10 being in the magazine and then 40 in reserve. Unpack a punch, it isn't the strongest gun in the game. That would probably go to the L96, but it has 500 damage with a headshot multiplier of 10. But when you do pack a punch the Dragunov, the damage will be on par with the L9 pack a punch, with 1000 damage, again with a 10 headshot multiplier, with 10 in the magazine and then 80 in reserve. So this thing's easily going to kill on the higher rounds. Even though they do the same damage, I would say the Dragunov is better than the L9 because of one reason alone, the fact it's semi-automatic, compared to the L9, which is a bolt action. Speaking of the L9, the base damage does 500 damage with a headshot multiplier of 10, with 5 in the magazine and 45 in reserve. And when it's pack a punch, you're getting 1000 damage with a 10 headshot multiplier, with 8 in the magazine and then 72 in reserve. Now the biggest drawback to this weapon is the fact that it is a bolt action, but it's still somewhat feasible on the higher rounds because the damage is the same as Dragunov. You just have to be better at aiming. Moving on to the HS-10. This gun has damage of 160. It has 6 in the magazine and 36 in reserve. Now in the lower rounds, it's okay. It does alright. Again, when you pack a punch it, you're going to get them dual wield, so that's pretty cool. And the damage goes up to 300. In theory, you should get a few kills with this. You kind of have to spread it. It is an okay weapon and you will probably get a few kills with it, but I'd recommend some of the other weapons. Moving on to the Olympia, you have 80 damage with a multiplier of 8 with 2 in the magazine, and then you got 38 in reserve. It's a wall weapon, it's a starting weapon, but when you pack punch it, it actually turns out like an alright weapon. So when you pack punch the Olympia to the Hades, you'll have 200 damage for each pellet that hits a zombie, with 2 in the magazine and then 60 in reserve. This gun's actually alright stat-wise when you pack punch it and such. I mean, long-term and practicality is not that great, but it is a wall weapon, so you can go get ammo for it. But genuinely not memeing, it's actually not that bad. Moving on to the Spaz 12, when unpack a punch, it has 160 damage per pellet that hits, it has 32 shots in the reserve, and then it has 6 in the magazine. When you do pack a punch it though, it turns into the Spaz 24, with 300 damage with every pellet that hits, totaling to 2400 damage, with 24 in the magazine and 72 in reserve. This gun is absolutely going to get kills. It's going to get a good few kills in round 50. It's actually quite a beast. The only thing it kind of lacks is a little bit of ammo, but then again it has more than the Olympia, so yeah. The thing with each of these shotguns is it looks like they all do the same damage. It's just how fast it can output that damage when they're pack-a-punched. Keeping that in mind, moving on to the stakeout with 160 damage for each pellet that hits, with 8 pellets able to hit a zombie, with 6 in the magazine and then 54 in reserve. It's kind of meh, but when you pack-a-punch it, it'll have 240 in terms of damage for each pellet, and it can have 10 pellets that hit a zombie. It's a pump action, so it's kind of slow, but it has 10 in the magazine and then 60 in reserve. It's actually not that bad in terms of stat. The damage is quite high on it, just like the other shotguns, which are all the same. It just kind of takes a while and is a bit slower compared to other guns. Moving on to quite possibly the worst gun in this game, the China Lake. The base version does 600 damage, with 2 in the magazine and then 20 in reserve. When you pack punch it to the China Beach, you'll get 1000 damage per shot, with 5 in the magazine and 40 in reserve. You'll maybe barely get 1 kill with this thing. It's so bad. It's the worst gun in this game, hands down. It's worse than every other gun in this game. There's a reason to take everything else. The China Lake is just very, very meh. But what is really good is the M72 wall, with 2000 damage, with 1 shot in the magazine and 20 in reserve. When you pack punch it, it goes to 3000 damage, which is absolutely insane first of all, with 10 in the magazine and 40 in reserve. Since this thing has splash damage, you're going to get a lot of kills with it. It's very, very powerful. Might not be the most practical, but in terms of damage, it is up there. It's quite high. Ballistic knife, we're not really going to cover this seriously because it won't do that much damage, but when meleeing with it, what you're getting in terms of damage is 500, or if you have the Bowie knife, you'll get 1000. You get 1 shot in the magazine and then 4 in reserve. Pack-a-punching it, the damage will go up to 1500, with 1 shot in the magazine and 9 in reserve. Moving on to the crossbow, base version, 400 damage, 1 shot in the magazine and 12 in the reserve. Pack-a-punching it, it goes up to 2500 damage, with 1 in the magazine and 12 in reserve once again. But the main reason you use this is because it acts like a monkey bomb. You don't use it for actually killing stuff. It's definitely more of like a protective weapon rather than anything else. Moving on to the World at War weapons that returned in the World at War maps, you got the Gavir 43 with 90 damage with a headshot multiplier 2.7, with magazine having 10 and in reserve 120. This gun's very basic, ain't gonna do much. When you pack a punch it, goes to 200, headshot multiplier goes to 6, magazine goes to 12 with 170 in reserve. I mean, I'm not going to recommend this gun around 50, but if you get all your headshots on a zombie, then yeah, you could kill it theoretically, but it's not going to be an easy or fun task, so I wouldn't say it's really viable for round 50 plus. Same like the M1 carbine as well, with the base version having 120 damage with a 2.7 headshot multiplier, 15 in the magazine, 120 in reserve. When you pack punch it, you're going to get 200 damage with a 6 headshot multiplier, with 15 in the magazine and 150 in reserve. It's kind of the same thing where, you know, you could get, theoretically, kill a zombie, but what's the point when there's other better weapons out there? Then moving on to the GOAT, the STG-44. Now, this bad boy is going to have 100 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, along with 30 shots in the magazine and then 180 in reserve. When you pack punch this bad boy, you'll get 150 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 60 in the magazine and then 300 in reserve. Now, not the worst gun, but again, you might get 1 or 2 kills with it, but it's not going to be that super effective on these high rounds. And comparing it to the other assault rifles where they just do a lot more damage, like, why would you use this, you know? Then moving on to the absolute baddest of boys, we have the Thompson with 120 max damage with a 4 headshot multiplier. This gun's going to have 20 in the magazine and 200 in reserve, and when you pack punch it, damage is going to go all the way up to 200 with 5 headshot multiplier, with 40 in the magazine and 250 in reserve. Now this gun is not that great, but it's good for ammo, first of all, good for insta-kill rounds, and it is in the perfect spot for the high round strat on Doris. So even though its killing potential might not be that great, it's going to be useful on the higher rounds. Now moving on to the stat-wise strongest SMG in this game, we have the Type 100. With the gun doing 100 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, 30 in the magazine and 160 in reserve. The ammo's okay, but unpack punch the damage isn't that great. When you do pack punch it though, it's similar to the Thompson with the 200 damage, with a 5.5 headshot multiplier. So I think in terms of SMGs, this gun has the highest headshot multiplier in the game, which outranks it slightly to all the other SMGs. With 60 in the magazine and 220 in reserve, this gun's also a wall weapon, so theoretically, yes, it's going to get you some kills, and it's a wall weapon, and that's pretty good. Moving on to the FG42, this gun has 100 damage with a 2.7 headshot multiplier, with 32 in the magazine and 192 in reserve. When you pack punch it, you're going to get 110 damage with a headshot multiplier of 3 with 64 in the magazine and then 400 in the reserve. But since the damage is already so low on this thing, it's not going to get you that many kills. Moving on to the most overpowered gun in this game, we have the Kar 98K with 100 damage with a 3.5 headshot multiplier. With 5 in the magazine and 50 in reserve, when you pack punch it to the Armageddon, you're going to get 200 damage with a 10 headshot multiplier, which isn't bad. It's, it's a good multiplier. With 8 in the magazine and 60 in reserve, but this thing still isn't that strong. I mean, comparing it to the other sniper rifles, with the headshot multiplier, you're getting the same damage as the other guns pack-a-punch, like the L115, or you have, obviously, the Dragunov as well, which they'll just do more damage in the long term. Sure, this thing is a wall weapon, so it has that going for it, but, I mean, hey, each their own, I guess. We then have the double barrel shotgun, which has 200 damage for every pellet that hits a zombie, with 2 in the magazine and 60 in reserve. Where you pack a punch it, that damage goes up to 380 with a 10 pellets in the actual shot, so if you shoot a zombie with all the pellets, it's going to do a pretty decent amount of damage actually. This thing's just like a better version of the Olympia, so yeah, it is a pretty good gun compared to it. And then you have our boy, the trench gun, which does 160 damage for every pellet that hits. And then you have 6 in the magazine and 60 in reserve. When you pack a punch into the gut shot, you're going to get 240 in the damage department for every pellet that hits, and there's 10 that can hit. With 10 in the magazine and 60 in reserve, this gun is really good all around just for killing in general, and it's really effective against dogs as well. Now that we've been through every gun in the game, talking about its damage, how effective they kind of are, I'm going to name off some of the actual guns that are viable in the high rounds that will get you more than a few kills. The M1911 is one of them where it will actually get you a pretty decent amount of kills, into the 10s if you're lucky. The Galil is another weapon where it's not mental compared to damage of the other assault rifles, but the ammo in it for some reasons. The Dragunov is another weapon that is severely underrated, with that headshot multiplier of 10 and already doing base 1000 damage when it's pack-a-punch. It's going to be able to kill a good few zombies on the higher rounds. If you're really good at aiming, because that's what all kind of comes down to at the end anyway, is your accuracy with these headshots. You could get an insane amount of kills with it. And when going over these weapons as well, I know I say that, like, you won't get a kill with this. Theoretically, every gun in this game, you pretty much could if you hit all your headshots on one zombie. But it's just a very hard task to do. Now, the Spaz 12 is more maybe my, like, guilty pleasure for gun, but I feel like on high rounds, it's the shotgun that you can notice it actually killing the fastest. It does have the fastest fire rate out of them, but the ammo doesn't keep up with the weapon, so you'll get a good few kills on the higher rounds with it, but this is more just, like, my personal, like, yeah, I like this gun, it's cool. It's cool. And one of my personal favorites, which I didn't really think was going to be that good, is the M72 Law, where it does that 3,000 damage per shot, and there's a good 50 shots in this. Playing on a map with PhD, this thing's an absolute monster and will kill a decent chunk of zombies. And not that it's practical at killing, but the crossbow is also a really good weapon just because it gets, like, the zombies away from you, obviously. But the strongest gun in this game that isn't classed as a wonder weapon is the Dragunov. And ultimately, if you're going through the box trying to get a gun that's actually going to kill in the higher rounds, this is going to be the gun that's going to do it. The L9 does the same damage, it's just a lot slower, and the Dragunov has more damage as well. But anyway, that's every Black Ops 1 gun and, like, their chances of actually killing. Again, theoretically, most guns in this game could get 1 or 2 kills if you got every headshot on a zombie, but that's very inaccurate considering the high rounds are just a bit mental and the hordes spread out. So for a lot of these guns, theoretically, yeah, you could, but it's not going to be easy and it's not going to be viable whatsoever. The guns that are actually going to kill zombies and you're going to notice it are the ones I kind of listed off just back there. First of all, we're going to be covering the ray gun, and for the ray gun and the Wunderwaffe, we're going to be covering the World at War / Black Ops 1 versions of it, because the damage profiles on the weapons are the exact same. Covering the ray gun Unpack-a-Punch, you're going to see that around 100, it's going to do absolutely nothing. And to keep in mind for this video as well, all zombies on round 100 have over 5.5 million health. So the ray gun and Pack-a-Punch is going to have a potential of 1,500 damage, with the multiplier being 4 to the head. So you could go through literally dozens of ray guns and you're not going to get a single kill with it. Moving on to the upgraded variant of the ray gun, Porter's X2 ray gun. The max damage you're going to reach with this is 2,000, with the head multiplier being 4 once again. With 40 shots being in the mag and 200 in reserve, this is still going to do absolutely nothing against a round 100 zombie. The unfortunate truth of these rounds are, unless the gun has infinite damage, it's probably not killing anything. Now taking a look at the Wunderwaffe DG2, this gun's going to get some kills. Keep in mind, the World at War version is kind of cursed, and it will essentially take away most of your health if you get splash damage from it. Since we're more focusing on the Black Ops 1 version of the Wunderwaffe, this isn't really an issue. In terms of ammo, you're going to have 3 shots in a mag and 15 in reserve. The way the Wonder Weapon works is you shoot a zombie and it will spread out to other zombies in a chain reaction, having the potential to kill up to 10 zombies. So in the higher rounds, this thing will kill up to 180 zombies max. Now when you Pack-a-Punch the Wunderwaffe to the Wunderwaffe DG3, most of the things are going to stay the same with it. It's still going to kill 10 zombies at max. But the big takeaway from this is the giant ammo increase. It essentially doubles, so you're going to have 6 in your magazine and 30 in reserve, having a killing potential of 360 zombies. And hey, that's pretty good. Now moving on to the fan favorite weapon, the Thunder Gun. This thing has infinite damage as well. That goes for the zombies it actually kills. You'll see that in a shot of this, some zombies will get knocked back, and then ones only take 15 damage, funnily enough. In terms of ammo, you're looking at 2 shots in the mag and 12 in reserve, making its killing potential a lot higher than the Wunderwaffe, since there's not really a cap on how many zombies you can kill with it. When you Pack-a-Punch the Thunder Gun into the Zeus's cannon, pretty much everything stays the same. The only thing that changes is that you get 4 in your magazine and 24 in reserve, doubling the ammo. So again, just really upping that killing potential, which is always good. Moving on to the Winter's Howl, well, this thing is just pretty much awful. The maximum damage you're going to get with this is 1600, and with 6 shots in the mag and 24 in reserve, it is easily one of the worst wonder weapons ever made. And in terms of killing, you're going to kill absolutely nothing on the higher rounds with this, because it has absolutely nothing going for it. And when you Pack-a-Punch it to the Winter's Fury, its damage goes up a wee bit to 2400, so I mean, that's not bad. You get 9 shots in the mag and 36 in reserve. But again, on the higher rounds, you need to go through probably hundreds of these to get a single kill. Which is a shame, because I think it's actually a pretty cool weapon. It's just really, really fucking bad. Moving on to our next gun, the VR11. So this weapon actually does 0 damage. It's more of a tactical weapon. If anything, it turns zombies into humans, and some zombies will chase it. When you Pack-a-Punch this thing though, it might not be good on solo, but on co-op it's actually kind of a beast. First of all, if you shoot a zombie 3 times, it's going to kill it. It'll just explode. With the ammo of this thing being 6 in the magazine and 18 in reserve, so doubling it. The main ability of this in co-op is that if you shoot your teammate, he's going to have infinite damage no matter what gun he uses, which is actually really powerful. Also, on George, if he's in the water and you shoot him, he'll disappear for the round. But on Call of the Dead, for high rounds, you'll be relying on George to drop Wunderwaffes, and he won't do that if you get rid of him that way. But to kill George, you'll have to use the Scavenger, which is the main wonder weapon of Call of the Dead. Now, this thing is a sniper rifle, bolt action. In terms of damage per shot, you're looking at 5,660, with 3 in the mag and 15 in reserve. The way this weapon works is that you'll shoot it and then it will explode, damaging all zombies around it. And when you Pack-a-Punch it, you'll get double the damage, so your damage will be at 11,320. You'll have 6 in the mag and 30 in reserve. On top of that, you'll be getting a bigger blast radius and an infrared scope as well. Now, it is seriously one of the coolest wonder weapons in COD Zombies, and it's personally one of my favorites. But on round 100, it's going to yet again do fucking nothing. If we were just to do rough math for how many shots it would take to kill a zombie, and to keep it easy, let's round the zombie's health to 5 million, right? We'll just do that to make it a bit easier. And we'll say the Scavenger does about 10,000 damage. If my math is correct, you'd have to go through a good 500 Scavengers to get a kill, which is obviously not very epic, and as cool as the wonder weapon is, again, it's going to be practically useless on high rounds. Moving on to our next weapon, the 3179 JGB 215. But we're just going to call it the baby gun because that's what it is. And that's what it does. It turns zombies into babies. Now, this thing actually doesn't have infinite damage, but what it does do is it will take a zombie, no matter what round it is, and take it down to 1 health. And essentially what you do is you run into them and it will kill them, or use whatever weapon you want to use. It will insta-kill them practically. And with 5 in the magazine and 20 in reserve, the killing potential of this gun again is very high. And when you pack-a-punch it, it only gets better. Pack-a-punching it to the fractalizer, it will give you 8 in magazine and then 40 in reserve. One of the other abilities it gains is it will turn the zombies into babies for a little longer, as there is a cooldown on that. And yeah, it's just a better version of it. More ammo, keeps the zombies and the babies a bit longer, gives you a bit more time to breathe. On round 100, this thing is going to be very effective, and it is such a great wonder weapon. Black Ops 1 nailed wonder weapons, and I feel like we need more wonder weapons like this to return. Now moving on to our last wonder weapon in Black Ops 1 Zombies, we have the wave gun. And there's 2 modes you can have this in. You can have it in the wave gun mode or the zap gun dual wield mode. Both do infinite damage, with the wave gun itself having 2 in the magazine and 12 in reserve. And then the zap dual wield guns have 8 in the magazine for both dual wield and then 64 in reserve. And looking at the pack-a-punch variants of these, with the max wave gun, you're getting 4 in a magazine and 24 in reserve, so again doubling it, just has a higher killing potential. And then looking at the Porter's X2 zap guns, you have 12 in the magazine and then you have 100 in reserve. Since these things already do infinite damage, these pack-a-punch upgrades are just more ammo, but another quality wonder weapon. That's all the wonder weapons we have in Black Ops 1, kinda slash World at War. Let's move on to Black Ops 2. The M1911, this gun's going to do 20 damage, it is a starting pistol after all, and with the headshot multiplier, you're getting 3.5. Magazine size is going to be 8, and with 80 in reserve, not going to do much. When you pack-a-punch it to the Mustang and Sally, this is where things get better, just like the previous game Black Ops 1. It's going to do 1000 damage on a direct impact, but the explosive damage has a potential of 1200. With 6 in each pistol, because it's dual wield, with 50 in reserve, this gun easily is going to get you a few kills on the higher rounds. Something that's worth noting as well in Black Ops 2 is that we have double tap 2.0. So any bullet based weapon is essentially going to do double the damage, because there's going to be 2 bullets for 1. It's not just the fire rate that increases, the overall damage of each weapon will be enhanced significantly. And all the weapon damages we go over will be doubled for all bullet based weapons. So all the weapons I go over in the damage profiles, you can essentially just double it, and that's the damage that it potentially can do. Moving on to the Python, this gun can potentially do 1000 damage with a 1.5 headshot multiplier, with 6 in the magazine and 84 in reserve. When pack punching it to the Cobra, it's going to do 1000 damage, yet again, but it's going to have a free headshot multiplier, doubling it from its previous. With 12 in the magazine and then 96 in reserve, this gun on the higher rounds with double tap 2.0 is going to be somewhat of an effective weapon. You're going to get a few kills, but ultimately comparing it to the other weapons in this game, it's not that great. It's a very good pistol, but it just lacks in other departments. Moving on to the 5.7 that you can get by itself, or you can get dual wield. This gun has the potential to do 160 damage with a 3.5 headshot multiplier. The magazine size is going to be 20 with 120 in reserve. When you pack punch this to the Ultra, it's going to do 300 damage, and then you have a headshot multiplier of 3.5 once again, with 20 in the magazine and 200 in reserve. This gun will get kills, but it won't be as effective as the Python and the M1911. So in the pistol department, it's definitely not the strongest. And with the dual wield version, the only thing that really changes is that you're getting a little bit more ammo in reserve for the pack punch version, with 295 with 20 in each pistol. But this essentially makes it a little bit more difficult to go for that headshot multiplier, so you could end up be doing less damage anyway. But they're both alright weapons, it's just not what I would recommend for the higher rounds. Moving on to the B23R, this gun's going to do 160 damage, and this gun actually has 2 versions in the mystery box. So you're going to have the standard version that has 15 in the magazine, and you're going to have the one with the extended clip that has 24. With the standard having 105 in its reserve, and with the extended clip version having 168. So if you're going to go for any version, you're going to try and get that one. I don't think it's on all maps, unfortunately, but realistically it does just have more ammo. And when pack-a-punching it, the damage is going to go to 200 with a 3.5 headshot multiplier, with 20 in the standard version and then 30 in the extended clip version, and then going to the reserve you're having 180 in the standard and then 270 in the extended clip version once again. Realistically with this gun, I don't really see much point in using it. The only time I would really consider using it, even somewhat long term, would be on transit because it's on the bus, and sometimes it's just convenient to grab, but I wouldn't go past that and pack-a-punch it. Moving on to the most overpowered pistol in this game, the Executioner. So this gun doesn't have a headshot multiplier, it has shells, so just like the shotguns, it depends how many pellets are going to hit, and that's how much more damage you could do to a zombie. So the Executioner here has 130 damage for each pellet that hits, with 8 being the total, and with 5 in the magazine and 75 in reserve. In the lower rounds, it's going to be a good gun, but it's only when you really pack-a-punch it that this thing becomes a monster. With 350 damage times 12 if you hit all your pellets, with double tap 2.0, this thing is easily going to kill on the higher rounds. With 5 in the magazine, and then you have 100 in reserve, overall it's just a beefy weapon. This is something I would take with myself on the higher rounds. Moving on to the Cap 45, this thing is going to have 150 damage maximum with 3.5 headshot multiplier, with 12 in the magazine and 96 in reserve. This thing is fully auto, so that's pretty cool. When you pack punch it, it's going to do that 200 damage, and then it has a 3.5 head multiplier still, with 15 in the magazine and 180 in reserve. This is another one of those guns that, even though I enjoy using it, it's just something I wouldn't take with myself on the higher rounds. I just don't really see much of a point. But it's definitely one of those weapons that if you get it out of the mystery box, it's good to use in the lower rounds just for some points. Moving on to our Remington new model Army, this gun is exclusive to Buried and it pretty much has the exact same stats as the Python, with this gun having a maximum of 1000 damage with a 1.5 headshot multiplier, 6 in the magazine and 84 in reserve, and when you pack-a-punch it, it's going to have that 1000 headshot damage, but will have a 3 headshot multiplier with 12 in the magazine and then 96 in reserve. The one benefit of having this over the Python is the fact that it reloads a little faster, so if you're going to go for one or the other, I would always choose this, and it looks cool as well. Then moving on to our last pistol is the Mauser that is only in Origins. So this gun's going to act very similar to the M1911 when it's unpack-a-punch with 20 damage, a 3.5 headshot multiplier, 8 in the magazine and an 80 in reserve. But when you pack-a-punch it to the Boomhilda, it actually becomes the strongest pistol. I know we said the Executioner was, but this gun is miles better than it. With 1000 damage, with a 12 headshot multiplier, a whopping 50 in the magazine and 100 in reserve, this gun just becomes overpowered. It has the knockback effect like the ray gun, and that means you can traverse Origins a little easier with the mud. Overall, aesthetically, it's a cool weapon, but it's actually really good on the higher rounds against zombies and boss zombies alike. Moving on to our SMGs of Black Ops 2, we have the MP5. Now this gun's going to do 100 maximum damage with a 4 headshot multiplier. With 30 in the magazine and 120 in reserve, it is the perfect wall weapon for getting points. When you pack-a-punch it to the MP115, it's going to gain 40 damage, so it can do 140 damage, with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 40 in the magazine and 200 in reserve. This is a gun that's better just not pack-a-punching and using for points. On the higher rounds, it's not going to do that much, but it is a wall weapon, so it has that going for it. Moving on to the Chicken, it has 100 maximum damage with a 4 headshot multiplier. This weapon is a 3-round burst weapon, and it has 40 in the magazine and 120 in reserve. And when you pack-a-punch it, that damage will go up to 160 with a 5 headshot multiplier. It turns into a 4-round burst weapon, but when you pack-a-punch it and you get an attachment on it, you can get select fire, which makes it full auto. With 40 in the magazine and 200 in reserve, this gun's alright. It's not the best gun. It's a box weapon, so you can't get this off the wall. The mobility is okay, but overall there's just better guns to use in terms of SMGs. Moving on to the AK-74U, this gun's going to do 120 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier. And this gun's one of the other guns that have attachments. You can get the standard version, which will have 20, and then you have the extended clip version, which will have 30 in it. And then for the reserve, you're going to have 160 in the standard and 180 in the extended clip version. When you pack-a-punch it, you're going to get 190 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 40 in the standard magazine and 50 in the extended clip magazine. And for reserve, you're getting 280 in the standard and 300 in the extended clip. Now the 74U is a wall weapon, which gives it bonus points, and on the higher rounds you will get kills with it eventually, but it is an SMG, so what can you really expect? Not the greatest, not the worst. Realistically, there's only one SMG that I'd use on these higher rounds, which we'll get to in a little bit. Moving on to the PDW, this gun's going to have 90 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 50 in the magazine and 200 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, it's going to go up to 175 with 5 headshot multiplier with 50 in the magazine and 350 in reserve. Now this gun's the ideal point weapon. On higher rounds, it's very mediocre. It's not going to do a lot. The damage isn't that great. It does have that massive clip size though, so that's something that's going for it. But it is a wall weapon on future maps, and it is really satisfying to use. Won't do much on round 50 though, just like the M1927 or the Tommy gun will also not do that much. With 90 damage, with a 4 headshot multiplier, 50 in the magazine and 350 in reserve, when you pack-a-punch it, you're going to get 180 maximum damage with a 5 headshot multiplier with 50 in the magazine and then 400 in reserve. This gun is essentially just a better PDW in terms of ammo and stats and fire rate and all that stuff. It has 5 more damage, it has a lot more ammo, so if you're ever in the debate between using the PDW or the M1927, use the Tommy gun. Moving on to the Uzi with 100 damage, a 4 headshot multiplier, 25 magazine, and then 275 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, this gun gets a giant damage buff. It goes to 230 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 25 in the magazine and 300 in reserve. So a few things to take away from this weapon. First of all, it has the highest damage out of any weapon, which is great. And it also is a wall weapon. It's only on Mob of the Dead, but in terms of a wall weapon, it's a really good wall weapon. It has a decent amount of ammo, and this is one of the SMGs I would maybe use on the higher rounds if needs must. The only thing really holding back this gun is the fact that it's not on more maps, because it would be very useful on these other maps. Moving on to the MP40, which is exclusively in Origins, is going to do 110 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, 32 in the magazine, and 192 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, you're going to get 200 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 64 in the magazine and 256 in reserve. Now the MP40 is a great weapon, I love it. On Origins it's useful because it has a good few wall locations and it's a very convenient weapon. It's just one of them guns I probably wouldn't use late game, just like a lot of these guns on this list. I'd probably opt more for an LMG or one of the assault rifles. Moving on to my favourite SMG, and it might be my guilty pleasure, but I don't care. It's the Scorpio Evo. So this thing's going to do 110 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 32 in the magazine and 256 in reserve. But when you pack-a-punch it, the damage goes up to 210, which is alright, a 5 headshot multiplier, but the thing that really sells this weapon is its insane fire rate. With 1,250 rounds per minute, this gun is just a monster when it comes to killing mini-bosses and zombies alike. This damage might not be that high in comparison to some of these other weapons on this list, but the overall fire rate and the ammo that it has, which isn't too bad, makes it an incredibly useful weapon, in my opinion. Then moving on to the assault rifles, we have the FAL with 160 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 20 in the magazine and 180 in reserve. Ain't gonna do much, it's an alright weapon on lower rounds, but like anything it falls off relatively quickly, more in like the early 20s. And when you go to the the pack-a-punch version of the FAL, you're going to get 240 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 360 in reserve. This gun's very fine, it's not the greatest, it's not the worst, it's going to do okay damage on the higher rounds. Comparing it to some of the other guns in this game, 240 in terms of, damage is quite high, but it's kind of hindered by its slower fire rate, and it's not the most practical weapon. It is a 3-round burst when you pack-a-punch it compared to the semi-automatic. It's okay, wouldn't be my gun of choice in the higher rounds, but it's definitely better than the SMR. The SMR has 80 damage maximum with a 3 headshot multiplier, with 20 in the magazine and 140 in reserve. This gun's just very bad in general, we're not going to sugarcoat it. Moving on to the pack-punch version, 120 damage, which is very, very weak for an assault rifle, with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 420 in reserve. The only good thing about this gun is that it has that much ammo in it. It's constantly memed on. It's probably one of the worst weapons in zombies. It doesn't really have much going for it. It wishes it could be the MTAR. Speaking of the MTAR has 140 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier with 30 in the magazine and 240 in reserve. It is very much your standard assault rifle, but that's all it needs to be. When you pack-a-punch it, it's going to have 195 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier with 30 in the magazine and 360 in reserve. This thing also has a grenade launcher if you pack-punch it enough. It's pretty cool. It's alright on the higher rounds. It's not going to be amazing long-term. It's like very similar to the other assault rifles where they'll get you a good few kills and then that's it. One thing's for sure, the MTAR's ammo is a lot better than the Type 25, which has 110 damage, a 4 headshot multiplier, 30 in the magazine, and 150 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, the damage is going to go to 160, with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 270 in reserve. Again, just your other basic assault rifle. I wouldn't really recommend taking it on the higher rounds. It's fine. You might as well use it if you have it, but long term, it's not that great of a weapon. And it will get you a few kills in the higher rounds, but that's just about it. At least the fire rate's okay, which is something we can't really say about the M8A1, which has 100 base damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 32 in the magazine and 192 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, it's going to go up to 150, and it's going to have a 5 headshot multiplier with 42 in the magazine and 336 in reserve. It is a 4-round burst weapon. Don't get me wrong, this isn't going to hinder the gun completely. In terms of damage, it actually isn't that high compared to some of the other weapons you think it would be, considering it's a burst weapon, but sadly it's not. If only it was a wall weapon like the M16, it might actually be viable. Speaking of the M16, the base damage has 100 with a 4 headshot multiplier. It's a 3-round burst weapon. It has 30 in the magazine and 120 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, it's going to have 150 damage, with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 270 in reserve. We've seen the M16 before on Black Ops 1. It's fine as a weapon, it goes fully automatic when you pack a punch it, and that's pretty cool. The damage isn't incredible on this thing, but it's definitely a practical weapon. Speaking of a weapon that's not practical, the M14. The M14 has 105 damage, a 3 headshot multiplier, 8 in the magazine, and 96 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, the damage is actually going to be pretty good. It has 200 damage with a 6 headshot multiplier, with 16 in the magazine and 192 in reserve. So this gun biggest hindrance is that it's semi-automatic. The fire rate obviously isn't super fast on it, and that's why guns like the M16 will technically outrank it in terms of damage output. But in terms of the M14 and Olympia dispute, I'm M14 all day. It's a better wall weapon to use, and overall it's just a better weapon. One gun that's vastly superior to the M14 though would be the Galil, with 150 base damage, a 4 headshot multiplier, 35 in the magazine, and 315 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, you're going to have 220 damage, a 5 headshot multiplier, 35 in the magazine, and 490 in reserve. The Galil still stands as one of the strongest assault rifles. It's a really good weapon, and yeah, overall it's just a good gun to use. This is definitely a gun I would use in the higher rounds. It has the damage, it has the fire rate, it has the ammo most importantly, and I'm so happy they brought it back from Black Ops 1 into Black Ops 2. Moving on to one of my favorite weapons in terms of design, the M27. It's a shame it's only on Nuketown, but when you are on Nuketown, it is a pretty viable weapon. When you're looking at the damage output, you have 150, you have a 4 headshot multiplier, you have 30 in the magazine, and then 240 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, the damage is going to go up to 220, with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 360 in reserve. Now stat wise, this thing's very similar to the Galil. It just lacks a good chunk of the ammo the Galil has. But if you pick it up, I would use it. It's one of my personal favorite weapons. It feels good, it looks good, it sounds good, but it just kind of lacks out on that ammo department somewhat. Which you can't say about the AN94. This gun has 170 damage, a 4 headshot multiplier, 30 in the magazine, and 300 in reserve. Now when you're looking at the pack punch version, the damage is going to go up to 200 with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 50 in the magazine, and a whopping 600 in reserve. Now this gun is just an overall beast, and it's probably the best wall weapon in Black Ops 2. That's right, wall weapon. All the maps it's featured in, which are Die, Rise, and Buried, it is a wall weapon, and it's in pretty convenient locations as well on Die, Rise, and on Buried you can put it wherever you want with the chalk drawings. Overall, don't know why they decided to put this wall on the gun. It's a really good gun. You'd think it'd just be a mystery box weapon, but no, you can get it off the wall and it is an absolute beast. Just like you would be if you'd hit that subscribe button. Talking about another beast of a weapon, the AK-47. Now this gun's only exclusively on Mob of the Dead unfortunately, but whilst it's there, it is definitely a gun I would recommend using if you pick it up out of the box. With 150 base damage, with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 240 in reserve, it's an alright weapon. When you pack a punch it, the damage goes a bit insane with 250, with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 270 in reserve. Now, practicality, this gun long term, you know, it lacks a bit of ammo and such, and it's not that great compared to other guns. But whilst you're a Mob of the Dead, it's good to use. It's going to be really effective against Brutus because of that high damage, and it is somewhat of a viable weapon on the higher rounds, just kind of like how the STG-44 is. With 120 maximum damage, with a 4 headshot multiplier, 30 in the magazine and 210 in reserve, The base weapon's okay, but when you pack a punch it gets a whopping 200 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier with 60 in the magazine and 330 in reserve. The reason why you want to use this gun, it's a wall weapon, the damage is okay, and the ammo ain't half bad. Yeah, there's better guns, like the Scar H, but the STG is still a very good weapon. Speak of the Scar H, this gun's insane. So, the base damage is 210, which is more than the STG. The headshot multiplier is 3.5, and has 30 in the magazine and 270 in reserve. Now when you pack punch this gun, it's going to get 300 damage, a 4 headshot multiplier, 40 in the magazine and 440 in reserve. In all aspects, this gun's just great. Damage really good, the actual ammo is really good. In general, the gun is a really, really good assault rifle, and you'd be an idiot not to use it if you picked it up. Moving on to the LMGs, we have the Hammer. Now this gun's going to do a maximum of 190 damage, with a 3 headshot multiplier, 125 in the magazine, and 375 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, the damage is going to go up to 250. You're going to get a 3 headshot multiplier still, with the same magazine size of 125, and 625 in reserve. Now the Hammer is a beast of a weapon. It used to be a lot better. The recoil on it right now is, not that great. But back in the day, it was a lot more controlled. The damage is good, fire rate is good, ammo is pretty good as well. In terms of damage, it actually shares the same damage marks as a lot of the other LMGs in the game, but we'll move on to that, but it is an overall pretty beast weapon. Moving on to the RPD, this gun's going to have 140 damage with a 3 headshot multiplier, 100 in the magazine and 400 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, the damage is going to go up to 180 with a 3 headshot multiplier with 125 in the magazine and 750 in reserve. In terms of the actual damage department, this gun isn't that great, but in terms of ammo, it does pretty good. You have 100 more shots in this than you do with the Hammer. On higher rounds, it's going to be okay, but there's other LMGs I'd rather go for. I would rather go for the Hammer or the LSAT. Speaking of the LSAT does 190 damage with a 3 headshot multiplier with 100 in the magazine and 400 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, it's going to go up to 250 damage with that 3 headshot multiplier, 100 in the magazine and 600 in reserve. Now in terms of LMGs, this gun's a pretty good one. I overall like the aesthetic appeal, the damage is pretty good, the ammo is pretty decent, and you can also get it buried on that infamous spot on the wall where you do the parkour, you can pick it up early on. So yeah, there's some convenience to the weapon as well. Moving on to my favorite LMG in this game, it has to be the MG08. The base version of this gun is going to do 200 damage maximum with a 3 headshot multiplier, 100 in the magazine and 400 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, it's going to go up to 250 with a 3 headshot multiplier, 100 in the magazine still, but then 600 in reserve. This gun actually has a special ability compared to some of the other weapons. The bullets can ricochet off enemies to collide with other enemies, meaning that in terms of hordes, you can do a lot of damage. This gun is only on Origins, but I always make an effort to try and pick it up for first of all nostalgia and the practical weapon use of it. It's a pretty decent weapon, and when you're playing Origins, you just have to pick it up. Moving on to our snipers, we have the DSR-50, which will do 800 damage maximum with a 10 headshot multiplier, with 4 in the magazine and 48 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, you're going to get 1000 damage with that 10 headshot multiplier, 8 in the magazine and 96 in reserve. Now in terms of damage, this gun's really good. Alongside with double tap, this thing can sort of kill on the higher rounds really easily. It's a very static weapon. Obviously it's a bolt action, so it's not going to be the most fast at killing. But in terms of damage, in terms of ammo, overall the weapon is just very, very good. And you can get iron sights on it if you pack punch it a few times and you get the iron sights. So hey, I mean, even if you don't want to use the normal scope, you have the iron sights you can use. Moving on to the Barrett, that has a maximum of 600 damage, a 10 headshot multiplier, 5 in the magazine and then 30 in reserve. Pack punching it, you'll get that 900 damage with a 10 headshot multiplier, with 7 in the magazine and 42 in reserve. This weapon's biggest downfall is the fact that it doesn't have a lot of ammo. The damage is actually pretty good on it, and stat wise is pretty much identical to the SVU. Speaking of the SVU, this gun has 550 damage with a 10 headshot multiplier with 12 in the magazine and 96 in reserve. And when you pack punch it, you're going to get 900 damage with a 10 headshot multiplier with 12 in the magazine and 192 in reserve. This gun's also a wall weapon. It's so overpowered, and the fact it's a wall weapon makes it very viable on the higher rounds as well. It's going to do insane damage, and say what you want about Jimmy Zielinski, but his wall weapon choices for the future, like for the free maps he did in Black Ops 2, they're pretty fucking insane. They're pretty good. Moving on to the Ballista, this gun's only on Origins with 150 damage, a 4 headshot multiplier, 8 in the magazine, and 64 in reserve. When When you pack a punch it, the damage is going to go up to 400 maximum with a 10 headshot multiplier, with 10 in the magazine and 120 in reserve. This gun isn't that great. It is a wall weapon. It's exclusively on Origins, and I mean, it's kind of viable in the lower rounds, but I wouldn't take it anywhere past round 30. Moving on to our shotguns, we have the Olympia with 150 damage for each pellet that hits, and there's 4 pellets. This gun's able to hold up 2 shells at a time with 38 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, it's going to have 600 damage for each pellet that hits, and again it's 4 pellets. With the gun being able to hold 2 shells with 60 in reserve, this gun does do a decent amount of damage. On the higher rounds, I mean, it's not going to do insane. I wouldn't take it with me. It is a starting room wall weapon after all. But the gun is, you know, really hated towards, and the people over at the M14 gang, they kind of need to rate it in a wee bit because it is a good gun. Moving on to the Remington, this gun can do 310 maximum damage for every pellet that hits, again with their 4, with 6 shells and then 48 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, it's going to be 600 times 4 for the pellets, and then you have 10 shells that it can hold with 70 in reserve. Now, I always thought this gun was a lot better than it probably actually is. I think it's somewhat useful because it's a wall gun, obviously, and it's good on the lower rounds, and on the higher rounds, you will get kills with it. It'll just take a little while. There is definitely better shotguns to take with you, though. For example, the M1216. This gun's going to do 280 maximum damage for each pellet that hits, again with 4 being able to hit, with 16 shells that it can hold, with 48 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, you're going to get 975 damage for every pellet that hits, times 4 once again, with 24 shells it's being able to hold, with 72 in reserve. This gun overall is a beast. I love this gun. When you look at the actual damage, there's a lot more than the Remington and then the Olympia as well. It has a pretty fast fire rate alongside that. Sure, it's a box weapon, but overall, it's one of my favorite shotguns in Black Ops 2. Moving on to the S12, this gun's going to do 270 damage, with being able to hold 10 shells, with 30 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, when pack punching it, is going to go up to 560 damage for every pellet that hits, which is 4. And then you're going to have 10 shells that you can load into the gun, with 50 in reserve. And you can also get fast mags on this gun as well. In terms of the box weapon exclusive shotguns, I would say that this is probably not the best, but it's still decent. I would say that the M1216 is a better shotgun overall, though. Now moving on to my guilty pleasure, the KSG with 800 damage, with 14 shells that the gun can hold, with 56 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, it's going to be able to do up to 1000 damage, with 28 shells it can hold, with 84 in reserve. When reloading this gun, it can reload 2 shells at a time. The damage is insane on it. Moving on to the RPG, this gun's going to do 600 direct impact damage, with 1 rocket you can load in with 20 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, you're going to get 1200 damage on it. It can hold up to 8 rockets that it can shoot with 40 in reserve. The gun damage is pretty good. I mean, it's not a bad weapon to have. The only thing that's lacking is PhD in this game, where you can only really get it on Buried in Origins. So if you're going to use this, I'd only really use it on them maps, but in terms of damage, it's pretty good. It's a fun weapon. And overall, it is still a pretty big hell of a beast. The War Machine, on the other hand, is pretty mediocre. It does 200 direct impact damage with 450 explosive damage, with 6 grenades that it can hold up to with 18 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, the damage is going to go up to 600 for direct impact, with 900 explosive damage, with 6 grenades it can hold up once again, with 48 in reserve. The damage on this thing just isn't that great. I mean, it's alright, I guess. When you pack a punch it explodes on impact, which is kind of cool. But not something you want to be taking on the higher rounds. Just like the ballistic knife, this gun's going to do 500 melee damage, or if you shoot, and 1000 if you have the Bowie knife with it. It has 1 like knife thing in the magazine, I guess, and 4 in the reserve. When you pack a punch it, it's going to do 1000 melee or shoot damage, with 1 in the magazine and 9 in reserve. Overall, this gun's good for mobility and reviving your friends, but I wouldn't use it on high rounds to kill zombies. Moving on to the Death Machine. This gun's actually pretty good. I like it. It's going to do 220 damage, with 150 in the magazine and 300 in reserve. When you pack punch it, it's going to do 350 damage, with 550 in the magazine and 550 in reserve. I like this weapon for its aesthetics, and it will get kills in the high rounds, but the mobility and the kind of lack of damage as well, it just makes it not a really good weapon to use. And to be honest, you'd be better off using something like the LSAT that actually has a bit of significant damage behind it. Moving on to the ray gun, it does 20 in the magazine and 160 in reserve. When you pack punch it, 2000 splash damage, with 40 in the magazine and 200 in reserve. This is going to be one of the better guns on the higher rounds, just because it has a pretty high amount of damage it can do. And with the ray gun Mark II, this gun's going to do 2,300 damage with 21 in the magazine and then 162 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, the damage is going to double and going up to 4,600 with 100,000 headshot multiplier. With 42 in the magazine and 201 in reserve, this gun's by hands down the best gun to use on the higher rounds because of the insane damage it does. Now moving on to our Black Ops 2 guns, we'll be again going over the ray gun, as I think it's fit to go over every version of the guns in the game, just in case they act differently, and the ray gun in this case does not. It's going to do the exact same thing it would do on World at War and Black Ops 1, with the base version having the maximum damage of 1,500, and then the pack-punch version having the maximum damage of 2,000. Again, as nostalgic as the ray gun is, it's just not very effective on pretty much any game it's on in the later rounds. Then moving on to the ray gun Mark II. Now this thing is a beast. It has the potential to actually do stuff on the higher rounds, with the base version having damage of 2,300, but with headshot multiplier you're getting 50,000. In terms of ammo, you're having 21 in the mag and then 162 in reserve. Just a quick side note though, the reload on this thing is an absolute bastard. You can't YY at all, so you're gonna have to wait a good 3 seconds before you can, And then when you pack punch it to the Porter's Mark II ray gun, this is where things get really interesting. First of all, the normal damage is 4,600, but then the headshot damage is 100,000. So that's 10 times the scavenger, and the ammo gets a significant increase as well, with you having 42 in the mag and then 201 in reserve. Now, on round 100, this thing isn't going to do a lot. But any non-infinite killing wonder weapon was going to kill something, it would be this here. Like, it's somewhat feasible with the ray gun Mark II. You'll probably need a max ammo to do the complete job, but this thing does have the potential to kill a zombie around 100 in time that isn't completely unreasonable. Speaking about unreasonable, let's move on to the jet gun. So, the jet gun kills infinitely, but it's the most awkward weapon you'll ever use. It breaks if you use it for too long. You get sucked into the zombies, so if you're on a high round, realistically, you're most likely going to go down with this unless you mastered the melee technique to come out with it. But on a map like Transit, where the only other weapon is the ray gun Mark II, this is going to be your best way to get through the higher rounds, because it does kill. It can also suck through drops for buildings, and it can also make it so you fall down faster when you jump off something like a ledge. The way I look at the jet gun is that it's like the jet gun and the paralyzer are different sides of the same coin. So while the paralyzer is very convenient and practical, it doesn't kill infinitely, whilst the jet gun is very inconvenient, but it does kill infinitely. Also, considering there's not like an ammo cap or anything on it as well, it does, and it's really unfortunate that it does. I mean, if Transit had some traps or something, that it would be better, because then you could kill some zombies with that whilst using the jet gun. Or if the jet gun just didn't fucking break after you use it for 5 seconds, that would also be pretty cool. But unfortunately, there's not. So this is really the only way to kill zombies in the higher rounds. Moving on to Mom of the Dead, we have the Blundergat. Now, the normal version of the Blundergat does 1,500 damage, it has 1 in the magazine and 60 in reserve. A pretty decent weapon, but around 100 it's not really going to do anything. When you pack punch it to the Sweeper, you're going to get 5,000 damage with 2 in the magazine and 120 in reserve. Now, the damage is pretty good. It's going to be able to melt the warden pretty quickly, but you're going to get nowhere near killing a zombie on the higher rounds. Now, going on to the other variant of the Blundergat, you have the Acid Gat, which does 2,000 damage max, and it's 3-round burst with 3 in the magazine with 90 in reserve. Now, this weapon's other ability is that it attracts zombies to it, so it's like a monkey bomb in a sense. So it's good for getting out of sticky situations like that. And when you pack punch it to the Victrolic Withering, it's going to go from that 2,000 damage all the way with the potential of 7,500. Again with a 3-round burst with 3 in the mag with 150 in reserve. And when you pack a punch it, it does attract more zombies to it. Because it's not completely like a monkey bomb, zombies aren't always going to go to it as much. But on the higher rounds, unfortunately, this still isn't going to do very much in the grand scheme of things. You're going to be using this as the defensive weapon to get out of sticky situations, whilst you use the traps and such to get to the higher rounds. Moving on to Buried with the Paralyzer. Now, This is, again, an interesting wonder weapon. So, the damage it potentially can do is, well, technically infinite, because it has infinite ammo, and it has a cooldown. The actual damage it does output is 100,000, whatever that means, I guess. Because I guess you could keep using it, but it slows zombies down and then eventually will disintegrate them. But to be honest, on the higher rounds, this isn't going to be the most effective way of actually killing zombies. Like, if the full damage potential of this gun is that 300,000 and a zombie's health is 5.5 million, that's going to take a lot of time, and you might as well just use the buildables on the map because they insta-kill permanently. And when you pack punch it, the damage is the same, and it kills slightly faster, but yeah, like, it's not that great of an upgrade. Like, as much as it pains me to say, as much as I hate the jet gun, it has more of a killing potential than the paralyzer does, which is one of the most cursed things ever, don't get me wrong, but hey, here we are. Moving on to the staffs, first of all, we have the Staff of Fire. Now, this gun will do 1,000 damage, and any knock-on effect damage will be 150. Now, it has 9 in the magazine, with 90 in reserve. When you upgrade it to the kcosmicbusiness Blood, the weapon in terms of its standard shot will do the exact same damage as the unupgraded one does, with the melee doing 1,846 damage, and then a charge shot doing 300,000 damage. And with the magazine having 12 shots in it now, and in reserve having 120, it's a pretty good weapon, but it's not going to kill anything on the higher rounds, it's just not strong enough. Just like how the lightning staff also isn't strong enough, with the base variant also doing the same. All the base variants of staffs do roughly the same damage, but when you upgrade the lightning staff, it will have a potential of 30,000 damage, and overall it's just very, very weak. You're not going to kill anything on the higher rounds. Sure, it has 80 in the magazine and then 180 in reserve, which I'm pretty sure is the highest out of all the staffs, but in comparison to everything else, it's just pretty useless. I would say it's the staff with the most aura foe. Moving on to the ice staff, again with the 1,000 damage per shot and then 150 off the knockoff, with 6 in the magazine and then 60 in reserve. Now, when you pack-a-punch it, again, same with the normal blast shots, 1,000 damage, melee's 1,846, but a charge shot is 15,840,814. So it has such high damage. It's not insta-killing, it's not infinite killing, but the damage is so insane that it's going to easily get through the higher rounds up until you hit that zombie with that health. It has 9 in the magazine and 90 in reserve, and overall is an insane weapon, but the best staff down to technicality has to be the Staff of Wind. With 3 in the magazine and 40 in reserve, it's pretty much like the other weapons, but when you upgrade it with, again, 1,000 damage per basic shot, but when you use a charge shot, it does infinite damage. With 6 in the magazine and 60 in reserve, it is the best staff you can use. The ice staff has higher killing potential until it reaches that benchmark, but the wind staff is overall a better staff. And I also forgot to mention for the fire staff, it is the most broken staff in the game because it will crash your game. You just don't use it. You're not going to kill anything anyway, so you might as well just avoid using it. Now moving on to Black Ops 3. The Bloodhound, this gun's going to do 50 damage with 3.5 headshot multiplier, 8 shots in the magazine and 80 in reserve. As a starting pistol, it has the most damage as a starting pistol, I'm pretty sure. And when you pack punch it to the meat wagon, you're going to get them dual wield. There's going to be 1,200 damage per projectile with them. You have 8 shots in each pistol, and then you have 50 in reserve. Now these guns will get you a few kills on the higher rounds. Now you can't put ammo mods in it. In this video, we're obviously not basing the weapons how effective they are with ammo mods, because they'd all be insta-kill weapons, or should I say infinite killing weapons. But if you're on round 50, this gun isn't exactly a bad weapon to have. Moving on to the RK5, the maximum damage you're going to get out of this weapon is 100, with a 2 headshot multiplier, with 15 in the magazine and 120 in reserve. A great starting weapon. You're going to get it free when you complete all the Easter eggs alongside your starting pistol. And when you pack punch it, you're going to get 300 damage, so the damage is increasing quite a bit, with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 180 in reserve. On the higher rounds, it's not impossible for this thing to get you a few kills, but it's not going to be very practical compared to some of the other weapons. It is a wall weapon, which is always good, so you can always go back for ammo for it. But it's much better as a starting point gathering weapon. Moving on to the L-Car, this gun's going to have 150 damage with a 2.5 headshot multiplier with 20 in the magazine and 160 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, it's going to get 225 damage with a 6 headshot multiplier with 40 in the magazine and 200 in reserve. Now this is a pistol yet again, it's good for getting points in the lower rounds, but when it is pack-a-punched, it is, somewhat effective. The damage isn't completely awful. Just like the RK5, it is likely to get you a few kills, but I can't help but recommend an assault rifle or even an SMG instead, because they're just more practical. Most of the time they have more ammo, and the only thing a pistol might have over it is the mobility. Now moving on to the MR6, the other starting pistol we have. It's going to have 20 damage, a 3.5 headshot multiplier, 8 shots in the magazine, and 80 in reserve. Again, it's a starting weapon, so it's going to be pretty weak. When you upgrade it to the Death and Taxes, it's going to get 1000 damage, 6 shots in each pistol, and 50 in reserve. Overall, again, this gun, pack-a-punch, is kind of like the Bloodhound. It will get you a few kills on the higher rounds, but there is no PhD in this game, so it means it can be quite dangerous as well, compared to using, like, I don't know, an assault rifle or something. But it is a pretty effective weapon for getting actual kills. Moving on to the Marshall, that is exclusive to Zetsubo no Shima. This gun's going to do 700 damage for each pellet that hits. It's going to have 2 shots in each pistol and 152 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, it's going to have 3098 damage in total from all the pellets that it hits. It has a 1.5 headshot multiplier. You'll have 6 shots in each pistol and 230 in reserve. Now this gun's pretty effective. It's easily going to get you a few kills at least. It's good for getting zombies out of your way as well. You can just kind of fucking spam it. It's also a really satisfying weapon to use as well. It's just a shame it's only on Zetsubo. Moving on to the Rift E9, which is exclusive to Revelations. This gun's going to do 1200 damage. It's 2 round burst. It's 12 in the magazine and 144 in reserve. Now when you pack punch this thing, damage goes insane up to 3200. It has a times 10 headshot multiplier with 68 in the magazine and 272 from reserve. This thing is easily going to get kills in the higher rounds. It might not be the most practical weapon, sure, but it's kind of like the ray gun in a sense where you have to line up your shots and really go for them headshots because of how high the headshot multiplier is. Moving on to the M1911, this gun is going to have 20 damage per shot, a 3.5 headshot multiplier with 8 in the magazine and 80 in reserve. Very similar to the MR6 in that regard. When you pack-a-punch it to the Mustang and Sally, it's going to have the potential for 1200 damage, 6 shots in each pistol with 50 in reserve. Again, this gun is going to get you a few kills in the higher rounds because it does a lot of damage, but without PhD, it's not always going to be super safe. Moving on to our last pistol, the Mauser. This gun's going to do 20 damage with 8 shots in the magazine and 80 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, it's going to do 1000 damage with a 12 headshot multiplier with 50 in the magazine and 100 in reserve. This pistol is again going to get you a pretty good bunch of kills in the high rounds, just like how it did in Black Ops 2, and you can pretty much just spam the thing to infinity as well. It'd be nice to add a bit more ammo though. Now with pistols out of the way, we can move on to SMGs. First up we have the Kuda that can do the maximum damage of 110 with a 4 headshot multiplier, 30 in the magazine and 210 in reserve. When pack-a-punch, the damage goes up to 150 with a 5 headshot multiplier with 50 in the magazine and 350 in reserve. So the Kuda is essentially the MP5 of this game, and it's a pretty solid weapon on the lower rounds for points and such, but on the higher rounds it really isn't going to do that much. It's a wall weapon after all, so you can always go back and get more ammo, but it's definitely not a weapon I would recommend for the higher rounds. Just kind of like the VMP. This gun's going to do a maximum of 95 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier with 40 in the magazine and 240 in reserve. When pack-a-punch, the damage is going to go up to 140 with 5 headshot multiplier with 40 in the magazine and 400 in reserve. This gun is only really good for points. I wouldn't even recommend pack-a-punching it. It's not going to be that effective on the higher rounds, but it is good for points. Moving on to the Weevil, this gun's going to do 90 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier with 50 in the magazine and 350 in reserve. When pack-a-punch, it's going to do 175 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier with 100 in the magazine and 500 in reserve. So this gun's one of the stronger SMGs in this game, and with a decent amount of ammo as well, you are going to be able to get a few kills with this on the higher rounds. It's not a wall weapon unfortunately though, and it is always going to be better for just getting points when it's unpack-a-punched. And it's not something I would super recommend for the higher rounds, but having 100 bullets in his magazine is pretty useful for insta-kills and such. Moving on to the Vesper, this gun's going to do a maximum of 100 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 210 in reserve. When pack-a-punch is going to do 140 with a 6 headshot multiplier, with 60 in the magazine and 360 in reserve. Now this thing does have pretty decent fire rate, but in terms of the actual damage it's not that great. It's very similar to a lot of the other SMGs, but it's definitely better than the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh will do 80 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 40 in the magazine and 160 in reserve. When pack-a-punch, it's going to get 150 damage, a 5 headshot multiplier, with 60 in the magazine and 300 in reserve. Now, I can't really think of any super big positives for this gun other than its mobility. The damage isn't that great, the fire rate is a 4-round burst, so it's not like dreadful. It's very much like the Chicom from Black Ops 2, but I would say worse. And the ammo is very similar to the other SMGs, so it's not like it has an advantage in that department. Overall, I just avoid using this weapon. Moving on to the Bootlegger, this gun's going to do 150 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 32 in the magazine and 192 in reserved. When pack-a-punch, it's going to do 190 damage with a 5.5 headshot multiplier, with 64 in the magazine and 320 in reserve. Now in Shadows of Evil, this gun is something I normally pick up because it's in a convenient spot. The damage is okay and such on it, and with the headshot multiplier as well. You know, it's not going to be a completely awful weapon. The ammo is okay as well, and it's satisfying to use. Something I probably wouldn't recommend using on the higher rounds, but it definitely get you a few kills. The damage is okay with the headshot multiplier as well, and it is a pretty cool gun. Moving on to the Razorback that is exclusively on Zetsubo no Shima. This gun's going to do 120 damage, with 30 in the magazine and 210 in reserve. When pack-a-punch, it's going to do 190, it's going to have 5 headshot multiplier, 60 in the magazine, and 420 in reserve. This gun yet again will get you a few kills. It's nothing to really write home about. The damage is okay. It's up there, kind of on the stronger end of the SMGs. It is a satisfying weapon to use. I just wish it didn't have that stupid ELO sight, whatever it's called. I think the iron sights on the Razorback are just so clean, and it would have been cool if we could have got that in zombies. Moving on to the HG40, which is exclusive in Zetsubo and then also Gorod, I believe. This gun's going to do a maximum of 110 damage with a 4.5 headshot multiplier, with 32 in the magazine and 384 in reserve. With pack-a-punch, it's going to do 210 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 64 in the magazine and 448 in reserve. Now I know this gun kind of gets memed on quite a lot, but the actual stats of the weapon are quite good in terms of damage and ammo and the headshot multiplier. The weapon is overall a pretty decent weapon, and is technically stronger than the MP40. So, I mean, if you like the MP40 and you shit on the HG40, I mean, it's actually kind of a better gun. It's just ever so slightly slower in fire rate. But if I got this out of the box, I mean, I'd probably use it for a little bit, but it wouldn't be something I'd use for the long term. Now moving on to the PPSH that is exclusive on Gorod Krovi and then some of the Zombie Chronicle maps. This gun's going to do 130 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 71 in the magazine and 426 in reserve. When pack-a-punch, it's going to do 190 damage with a 5.5 headshot multiplier, with 115 bullets in the magazine and then 690 in reserve. So this gun's just flat out one of the best SMGs in the game when it comes to damage, the actual ammo it holds as well, because it holds quite a lot of ammo. The fire rate isn't too bad, and overall it's just a quite effective weapon. It'll definitely get you a few kills in the higher rounds, and if I wasn't using a wonder weapon, you know, it'd be something viable on them rounds as well. Moving on to the M1927, this gun's going to do 90 damage with 50 in the magazine and 350 in reserve. When pack-a-punch, it's going to do 180 damage with a 5.5 headshot multiplier, with 100 in the magazine and 500 in reserve. The biggest asset to this gun is obviously the amount of ammo it holds. The actual damage itself isn't super great, but it's similar in terms of damage to the PPSH, it's just lacking a little bit in ammo. But comparing it to other SMGs, it does have decent stats. It has more ammo than most of them as well. It's just really against the PPSH, doesn't really stand much of a chance. Moving on to the MP40, this gun's going to do 110 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 32 in the magazine and 192 in reserve. When pack-a-punch, it's going to do 200 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 64 in the magazine and 256 in reserve. Realistically, I'm only really picking this thing up on Origins because it's a wall weapon. I wouldn't really use it on the higher rounds. The damage is okay, the ammo is fine. It is a strong gun and will get you kills, and it is in a few convenient spots on Origins itself, so it might not be a bad gun to pick up. Now last, the AK-74U. This gun's going to do 120 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier with 30 in the magazine and 240 in reserve. When Pack-a-Punch is going to go up to 190 with a 5 headshot multiplier with 50 in the magazine and 400 in reserve. I mean, this gun's okay. The MP40 is going to be better on it, and I think all the maps you can get this on the MP40 is actually accessible on as well. And the AK-74U isn't a wall weapon, it's a box weapon. So I probably wouldn't recommend using it on the higher rounds. It has a bit more damage than a lot of the other SMGs. At least the base SMGs in Black Ops 3. But long term, again, it's not that great of a weapon. Now moving to the assault rifles. The KN-44 is going to do 120 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier with 30 in the magazine and 210 in reserve. A Pack-a-Punch is going to do 200 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier with 50 in the magazine and 350 in reserve. This assault rifle is pretty decent, the damage is okay, it's a wall weapon on all if not most maps. And it will get you a few kills on the higher rounds, but there's definitely better weapons to choose from. The HVK does 110 damage with a 3.5 headshot multiplier with 30 in the magazine and 300 in reserve. Pack-a-Punch does 175 damage with a 4.5 headshot multiplier with 60 in the magazine and 480 in reserve. So the damage isn't as good as the KN, but the ammo is pretty high in this and the fire rate on this is overall pretty good. Again, one of those weapons where it's okay, but in terms of like an actual assault rifle, it's definitely not the best one to use in Black Ops 3, and I'd much rather use the ICR, which has 150 damage, a 5.25 headshot multiplier, 30 in the magazine and 210 in reserved. When Pack-a-Punch, it goes to 200 damage, a 6 headshot multiplier, 45 in the magazine and 360 in reserve. The reason I like using this gun is because it's very similar to the M27 from Black Ops 2 Nuketown Zombies. The damage is overall okay, the ammo is alright, the fire rate's pretty good as well. Overall, it's just a good assault rifle. But in terms of damage, the Man of War absolutely stomps on it. The base version of the Man of War has 210 damage with 3 headshot multiplier with 30 in the magazine and 270 in reserved. When Pack-a-Punch has 300 damage and a 4 headshot multiplier with 40 in the magazine and 440 in reserve. So the Man of War is the strongest full auto assault rifle in the game, and it's just such a good weapon, man. The ammo is pretty good as well. The fire rate's not as fast as other weapons, but I would look at it as the AN-94 of this game. Easy going to get you a few kills in the higher rounds, and if you get it from the box, then yeah, I would use it. A gun I wouldn't recommend using is the Shiva. It does 100 damage with a 3 headshot multiplier with 10 in the magazine and 100 in reserve. And when Pack-a-Punch, it does 180 damage with a 7 headshot multiplier with 30 in the magazine and 270 in reserve. Now, it's not that this gun's bad or anything, it's just kind of inconvenient and impractical. Just as a base weapon. The damage is actually okay with the headshot multiplier, but if you're using an assault rifle, you want something that's fast. If you're going to use a semi-auto weapon, you might as well use one of the sniper rifles. Moving on to the M8A7, this gun's going to do 120 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier with 32 in the magazine and 256 in reserved. When Pack-a-Punch is going to do 160 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier with 48 in the magazine and 480 in reserve. The M8's an okay weapon, it will get you a few kills on the higher rounds. And it is a wall weapon as well, which is, useful and such. The burst, it is what it is. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't. The ammo is pretty good. And overall, yeah, I mean, I would maybe potentially use this on the higher rounds. Moving on to the MX Garand. This gun's going to do 210 damage with 8 in the magazine and 160 in reserve. With Pack-a-Punch, it's going to do 500 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier with 30 in the magazine and 300 in reserve. So the damage in this is actually really high with the headshot multiplier. It's one of the strongest guns in the game, and to be completely honest, it's just a better version of the Shiva, I would say, essentially. It's not a wall weapon, and you can't reload it as you're shooting. You have to shoot the whole clip, and then you can reload. But in terms of damage, it is a beast. Moving on to the M14, this gun's going to do 210 damage, with 8 in the magazine and 104 in reserve. And when you Pack-a-Punch this thing, it gets really good. It's going to do 700 damage, with a 6 headshot multiplier, 16 in the magazine, and 208 in reserve. I never realized just how high the damage was on the M14 in Black Ops 3, but seeing it now, it's an insane weapon to use, and I can't recommend it enough. The ammo's not insanely great, sure, but if you pick it up from the box, I would definitely, use it on the higher rounds. Just like how I'd use the FFAR with 175 in terms of damage, with 4 headshot multiplier, 30 in the magazine and 390 in reserve, and when you pack a punch it you're going to get 250 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier with 90 in the magazine and 450 in reserve. So when I'm playing one of the maps that this gun's on, like Gorod Krovi for example, I'll definitely lean to it more than the PPSH anyway. I feel like it's just overall a better weapon. And at least in my experience, I found that I was getting more kills with this than the PPSH. The Peacekeeper Mark II will do 120 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier with 32 in the magazine and 352 in reserve. When pack a punch it's going to do 170 damage with a 5.5 headshot multiplier with 64 in the magazine and 512 in reserve. So this gun's okay, it is pretty much just your basic assault rifle. The ammo's pretty good and there's not much recoil on it either. The overall damage isn't that impressive, but there are just better guns in the box in the maps you can use this on, which are Revelations and then a few of the Zombie Chronicle maps I believe. Then moving on to the M16, this gun's going to do 100 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier with 30 in the magazine and 240 in reserved. When pack a punch it's going to do 150 with a 10 headshot multiplier with 30 in the magazine and 300 in reserve. Now this gun is not that great by itself, but with a headshot multiplier it does do a lot better. To be honest, I'd much rather use a Galil than anything else rather than this, but to be fair as well, possibly the reason why they gave it such a buff is because it's not a wall weapon anymore. If you're shooting at the body, this thing isn't going to do much. Headshots is going to be absolutely insane and do a lot of damage. Moving on to the Galil, this is going to do 150 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier with 35 in the magazine and 315 in reserve. Pack a punch is going to do 220 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier with 35 in the magazine and 490 in reserve. Overall, whenever the Galil's on a map, I'm always going to go for it, whether it's Black Ops 1, 2, or 3. Overall, the damage is insane, the headshot multiplier is good, the ammo is the big thing for me, it's really high in ammo, which I really like, and I'll always go for it. Moving on to the iconic STG-44, this gun's going to do 120 damage, with a 4 headshot multiplier with 30 in the magazine and 210 in reserve. Pack a punch is going to do 200 damage, with a 5 headshot multiplier with 60 in the magazine and 330 in reserve. Overall, this gun is actually pretty good. It's a wall weapon as well, which is always going to be useful. It's definitely not the best assault rifle, but again, it's a wall weapon, so that's always going to be really useful. And now we can move on to the LMGs. First of all, we have the BRM with 200 damage, a 3 headshot multiplier, 75 in the magazine, and 375 in reserve. Pack a punch is going to do 225 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, 100 in the magazine, and 700 in reserve. Overall, all the LMGs in this game I'm going to pretty much recommend, maybe bar one, but I would 100% take the BRM on a higher round. It's going to get you a good amount of kills, just like how the Dingo will as well. It's going to do 250 damage with a 2.5 headshot multiplier, 80 in the magazine and 480 in reserve. When pack a punch is going to do 380 damage with a 3 headshot multiplier with 120 in the magazine and 600 in reserve. This is personally my favorite LMG in the game. Overall, I think it's just really effective on high rounds, low rounds, bosses, normal zombies, the whole shebang. Moving on to the Gorgon, this gun's going to do 225 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, 50 in the magazine and 250 in reserve. When pack a punch, it's going to do 450 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 100 in the magazine and 500 in reserve. This gun's damage is actually really good, but at the same time it's really slow. So it's probably going to get more kills than the Dingo and the BRM, but it's also really impractical, and I just personally wouldn't recommend using it. A gun I would recommend using though is the Dredge with 200 damage, a 3 headshot multiplier, 90 in the magazine and 450 in reserve. When pack punch it's 250, a 4 headshot multiplier, 120 in the magazine and 720 in reserve. Overall, just a really effective weapon. The damage is really high, the headshot multiplier is good, it has a lot of ammo. It kind of gets slept on a wee bit. I know it's like a 6-round burst weapon and that's kind of annoying, but everything else about the weapon makes it a pretty decent weapon. Moving on to the RPK, this gun's going to do 300 damage with 100 in the magazine and 400 in reserve. When pack a punch is going to do 450 damage with a 3 headshot multiplier, 125 in the magazine and 500 in reserve. This gun's pretty good, the damage is really fucking high. And honestly, in the high rounds, again, I would recommend using this weapon. Moving on to the MG08, you have 200 damage, a 3.5 headshot multiplier, 100 in the magazine, 400 in reserve. Pack a punching it, you're getting 250 damage, a 5 headshot multiplier, 100 in the magazine, and 600 in reserve. When you're on Origins, you just have to kind of use this. It's a great gun, it's very iconic, it feels good, it looks good, and it will get you a good bunch of kills. Moving on to the sniper rifles, we have the Drakon. Moving on to the Dracon, this gun has 500 damage, a 7 headshot multiplier, 20 in the magazine and 100 in reserve. When pack-a-punch is going to go up to 800, the headshot multiplier is going to go up to 8, there's going to be 20 in the magazine and 140 in reserve. This gun is just a beast, to be fair. It's one of the guns you're going to want on the higher rounds if you're camping anyway. When it comes to training, it's also going to be really effective, just because of that headshot multiplier. Easily going to get you a good few kills in the higher rounds. Moving on to the Locust, this gun has 500 damage, a 10 headshot multiplier, 10 in the magazine and 60 in reserve. When pack-a-punch, it's going to go up to 900 damage, a 9 headshot multiplier, 25 in the magazine and 100 in reserve. This gun, yet again, is going to get you kills. It's going to be a bit slower because it's a sniper rifle. It's very much like the DSR in a sense. It's very similar to the SVG as well. There's not really much of a difference between these two weapons other than a little bit of damage. The Locust will get you kills in the higher rounds even if it takes a while. The SVG is very similar, as 800 damage, a 10 headshot multiplier, 6 in the magazine and 60 in reserve. When pack-a-punch, it's going to go up to 1000 damage with a 10 headshot multiplier, 10 in the magazine and 100 in reserve. This gun is again going to get you kills on the higher rounds. It'll take a while because it's quite a slow weapon, but just like the Locust, it's quite high in damage and it is going to get you them kills. Moving on to the shotguns, the KRM 262, this gun is going to have 225 damage per pellet, and there's 4, with a 2 headshot multiplier, 8 shells that you can use, and then 48 in reserve. When pack-a-punching it, it's going to go up to 3098, with a 2 headshot multiplier with 16 shells, and 64 in reserve. This gun is a beast, it's a wall weapon, and it's easily going to get you kills in the higher rounds. It's good against panzers alike as well. It's overall probably the best shotgun to have because it's a wall weapon. The Brecci is also a really good weapon with 250 damage for each pellet times 4, with a 1.5 headshot multiplier, 12 shotgun shells and 108 in reserve. Pack-a-punching it is going to go up to 2450 damage, with a 2 headshot multiplier, 24 shotgun shells and 120 in reserve. This gun is again a really good gun to have in the higher rounds, easily going to get you a few kills. Just how like the Haymaker is a really good weapon with 280 for pellet, which times 4, with a 2 headshot multiplier, with a 16 shotgun shells and 64 in reserve. When pack-a-punching it, the damage is going to go up to 2442, with a 2 headshot multiplier, with 25 shotgun shells and 125 in reserve. This gun again is going to do insane damage and kill a good bunch of zombies on the higher rounds. It's going to be great against the mini bosses. Then moving on to the Argus, you have 800 damage, a 3 headshot multiplier, 10 in the magazine and 60 in reserve. When pack-a-punching it, it's going to go up to 2000 damage with a 2 headshot multiplier with 32 in the magazine and 96 in reserve. Even though this gun isn't very practical due to a lot of its damage being based on headshots, it is a good weapon, I like using it. But the best shotgun in this game, and pretty much any COD game, is the Banshee. This gun's going to do 900 damage, 6 in the magazine and 60 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, the base damage is going to go up to 5000, but the headshot multiplier is 20. So this thing's on par with the Ray Gun Mark II, to put it in perspective. It's so insane. And this is one of them guns where you, even if you're on the super high rounds, you're going to want to use it if you're not going for alternate ammo types, because it will kill. Moving on to the launchers, the XM53 is going to do 2000 damage with 1 rocket and 20 in reserve. Pack-a-punching it is going to do 2000 damage with a 5000 damage explosion damage, with 2 rockets that you're able to shoot with 20 in reserve. It's an okay gun. I mean, if you bring it on the higher rounds, it would get you maybe 1 or 2 kills, but it's definitely not super practical. Just kind of due to the ammo being kind of low. But the L4 Siege is completely different, where the damage is quite high. The splash damage is 2233, but the direct impact damage is 4132, with 4 rockets that you can fire with 60 in reserve. When pack-a-punching it, the damage is going to go up to 3200 for splash damage and 2070 for direct impact damage, with 8 in the magazine and 80 in reserve. This is a gun that's going to get you a decent amount of kills because of the ammo and the actual damage it puts out. A gun that's not great on round 50 would be the NX Shadowclaw. Now, in terms of ammo and stuff, they're not bad, but it's just the practicality of them. The actual damage it does on the higher rounds is 750. It doesn't show a headshot multiplier here, but it says a 1-shot headshot kill until round 31. So I guess you can kind of scale it like that, where it will be able to kill him around 50, but it's not going to do so in style, at least. And moving on to the ray gun, we know what the ray gun's like. 1000 direct damage with 150 splash, with 20 in the magazine, 160 in reserve. Pack-a-punching it, that splash damage goes up to 2000, with 40 in the magazine and 200 in reserve. This gun is going to get kills in the higher rounds, but if you could get the ray gun Mark II, obviously you're going to want to get that instead, because the damage on that gun is absolutely insane, with 2300 damage and a 50,000 headshot damage, with 21 in the magazine and 162 in reserve. Pack-a-punching it, the damage is going to go up to 4,600, with the headshot damage going up to 100,000, with 42 in the magazine and 201 in reserve. That gun's definitely going to get you kills in the higher rounds. I think the big takeaway for weapons in this game are LMGs are really good, shotguns are really good, especially the Banshee. The ray gun Mark II is something you're always going to want to use. You kind of maybe want to avoid pistols and such just because they're kind of impractical, even if they have explosive damage. The L4 Siege is a pretty good rocket launcher. In terms of giving like highlighted weapons for each category, for pistols, I would have to recommend the Rift E9. It overall just does the best damage. For SMGs, the PPSH is probably the best one out of all the categories. In terms of damage, there are guns that do higher damage, like the HG40, but it is just the gun I would lean to. For practicality and such, the Man of War I would say is the best assault rifle overall. That or probably the M14 even, but with that it's not fully auto. Or the FAMAS is also a very good weapon as well. Along with the Galil, the assault rifles have a pretty good selections that you would, want to choose from. For actual LMGs, anything in this category is pretty good, bar the Gorgon. I won't recommend that just because of how impractical it is. Sniper rifles, the Drakon, and if you really want to, the SVG as well, I guess, but I probably wouldn't recommend using the SVG. The Drakon, I would 100%. And all the shotguns, maybe just bar the Argus, even for the damage is okay. And just doubling down on that Banshee, it's so strong. Gun doing the exact same thing it's done in the past games with 1,000 direct damage with the potential of 1,500 damage. And then 20 in the magazine and 160 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, it's the same benchmarks as before with a potential of 2,000 damage with 40 in the magazine and 200 in reserve. Again, ray gun is not going to do anything on the higher rounds, not in Black Ops 1, 2, or 3, so you're just best avoiding it. A gun that is good on high rounds is the Wunderwaffe DG2, once again with the exact same stats it's had before in the previous games, with infinite damage with the capability of killing up to 10 zombies, and then it has 3 in the magazine and then 15 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it to the Wunderwaffe DG3, again, the potential of killing 10 zombies, and then you have 6 in the magazine and 30 in reserve. Then moving on to one of the most broken weapons in COD Zombies, the Apothicant Servant. Now, for both pack-a-punch and unpack-a-punch, you're going to be getting infinite damage, with 1 in the magazine and then 9 in reserve for the unpack-a-punch version. And then for the pack-a-punch version, you're going to be getting 14 in reserve and 1 in the magazine. And the pack-a-punch version's black hole lasts longer. For some reason my game was glitching out and wasn't actually letting me pack-a-punch it. So you're just seeing the basic version of it, but it does the exact same thing just for a little bit longer. And this will kill infinitely. The only thing it won't kill is the boss zombies like the Margwa and then the Panzer as well. Moving on to the bows. You're looking at all of the upgraded versions having infinite damage. The base version has a potential to do 2,200 damage with 60 in reserve. All bows have 75 in reserve as well. But with all the stats kind of being the same and it's more how effective they are at killing, I'm just going to go through them all right now. So I think the Void Bow for practicality is just the worst. It's not bad, it's good, it infinitely kills, but it's just the one I would go to last. Then followed up by the Fire Bow, which I think is alright still, but compared to the Storm Bow and then the Wolf Bow, it just isn't as good. And then for me next, I'd have to say it would be the Wolf Bow. I think you could potentially kill more with this than you could the Lightning Bow, but the Lightning Bow is just so good for every situation, especially for camping. They're both super OP and will get you through the rounds. Then moving on to Zetsubo, we have the KT4, which has infinite damage, and it has 6 in the magazine with 36 in reserve. And you can also charge it up to make the abilities last longer as well. And you can upgrade it to the Masamune, which has the exact same ammo count, but the chain effect only lasts longer for 5 seconds. Naturally, you're going to upgrade it to the Masamune anyway, because it is just a little better, but both of them are good on high rounds and will kill, unlike our next gun, the GKZ-45 Mark III or the Ray Gun Mark III. But this gun's pretty unique. So you have the actual ray gun that does 4,348 damage. You have the JKZ part of it, which has like that black hole thing, which isn't like a black hole until you shoot them both, which does 550 damage. But when you create the black hole, you're getting 7,000 damage, with 3 shots being in the GKZ and then 15 being on the ray gun, because obviously it's dual wield, and then it has 161 in reserve. And when you upgrade it to the Maelstrom of your wrist, the damage does go up quite a bit. First of all, the GKZ will get 1045 damage, and the Raygun Mark III will get over 11,000 damage, which is on par with weapons like the Scavenger. And with the black hole effect you can make from it, you'll be getting 18,151 damage. And in the ammo department, you're looking at the JKZ having 5 in the magazine, and the Raygun having 30. And with the reserve, you're looking at 215. As cool as this gun is, it's not going to do anything on high rounds. It will slow stuff down, and it will be good against mini bosses, because I don't think their health scales the same as zombies do. But in terms of actually killing zombies, it's going to be fucking useless. You're better off using the Dragon Shield or a gun with a double pack ability. Now moving on to the Thunder Gun, and this is the exact same as it's been in previous games. With obviously having, you know, the 2 shots in the magazine and 12 in reserve, and shooting it can potentially kill everything that you shoot it at. The only thing that is different is that zombies that don't get killed by it, that get knocked back, take no damage at all compared to the 15 that they normally would. Which, I mean, is, who cares, right? What's also good about this Thunder Gun is that you can get drops from it, which is very useful. And when you upgrade it to the Zeus's Cannon, again, all the abilities are the same. It's just more ammo, so you're getting 4 in the magazine and 24 in reserve. And overall, just great weapon. And then for the Zombie Chronicle versions of the weapons, you're looking at the exact same benchmarks compared to the previous games. So, Raygun Mark II, base damage is 2,300, headshot damage is 50,000 damage, with the 3-round burst, the 21 in the magazine, and then with being in reserve, 162. When you pack punch it to the Porter's Mark II ray gun, you're getting that 46,000 damage with 100,000 damage. If you get the headshot multiplier, with 42 in the magazine and 201 in reserve. Also doing the exact same thing is the baby gun. It will shrink the zombies and it'll make it so they're 1 a hit, or whatever weapon you want to use, with 5 in the magazine and 25 in reserve. And when you pack a punch it, does the exact same thing, with it making it so the zombies are babies for a little bit longer. It's 15 seconds compared to 5, just so you know. And with 8 in the magazine and 40 in reserve, it's still going to be able to do a whole lot on the high rounds. Same with the wave gun, which will again do infinite damage with 2 in the magazine and 12 in reserve. And when you pack punch it, the max wave gun has 4 in the magazine and 24 in reserve. And for the zap gun dual wields, again infinite ammo with 8 in the magazine and 80 in reserve. And then with the pack punch version, you're getting 12 in the magazine and 124 in reserve. Then going for the staffs once again, the normal shot will do that 1000. And then with the magazine having 9 shots in it with in reserve 90, and when you pack a punch it, again, same with the base shot, but when you charge it, it will do 300,000 damage with 12 in the magazine and 120 in reserve. The Kazutsuchi's Blood is a good weapon, just not in the high rounds. And then the Ice Staff again doing the same thing with 6 in the magazine and 60 in reserve. And when you upgrade it to All's Arrow, it's going to be doing the 15,840,814 damage shot, which is going to kill for a very long time with 9 in the magazine and 90 in reserve, making it so it's very feasible for that round. Then with the Lightning Staff having 12 in the magazine and 120 in reserve, then going to Kemet's Bite, you're getting that charge shot with 30,000 with 18 in the magazine and 180 in reserve. This weapon's going to do nothing on the higher rounds. And then finishing off with the Wind Staff, again having the same abilities as the other, with 3 in the magazine and 40 in reserve. But then upgrading it to the Berea's Fury, it's going to have infinite damage, with 6 in the magazine and 60 in reserve. So that's every weapon covered on round 100 and what ones are actually going to be effective. Again, if this video gets 200 likes, I will make a part 2 with Black Ops 4, Cold War, and possibly Vanguard if you guys can convince me to buy it. I'd also be very up for going on games like Infinite Warfare, Exo Zombies, and then World War II to get the damage profilings on them weapons as well and seeing how effective they actually are on the higher rounds. The only issue with them games is that I'd have to actually get to round 100 for each map to try out the weapon. So I'd have to stream that and you guys would have to watch it. And if you guys enjoyed this video, you might enjoy this video here where I tell you guys what doors to buy and not to buy on every single zombie map.